Things hadn't been too happy for Rod at home lately. His marriage had, interest and excitement-wise, taken on rather a dull shade of grey. He convinced himself it was all his wife's fault. He began noticing that the place always seemed untidy. It probably was no different, but in his present mood, trifling things annoyed him intensely. His wife, Helen, always seemed slovenly and unkempt in his eyes. They never talked to each other anymore. The television set was never off. The meals she cooked for him were no longer adequate, even though they were probably just the same as they'd ever been. He didn't seem able to control his temper anymore either. But Helen had grown accustomed to his ranting, and even his shouting and thumping on the table could not awaken a responsive chord in her. Her hypnotized gaze remained riveted to the TV picture. Rod, demoralized by her total disinterest, stormed out of the house. If his wife refused to be a living, responsive companion, well, he knew where he could find a substitute. To Helen's female logic, Rod's behavior of late added up to just one thing: another woman. This was guilt raising its ugly head. Right, she'd been thinking about it for days. Now her mind was made up. She would hire a private detective. This way, she would find out for certain, one way or the other. He would eat those sausages if the last thing he did. She would see to that. They say that when a man is having an affair, the last one to find out is his wife. Don't you believe it? Helen was onto her husband's guilty secret straight away, but she didn't let on. And Rod thought he was being so clever as he phoned her to say that he would be late home yet again. As he waited for her to answer, he pictured in his mind what she would probably look like. Most likely in curlers, still dressed in that awful dressing gown that she always wore. Definitely not glamour. He couldn't remember the last time she made an effort to look attractive. Helen appeared to take his excuses. She was so trusting. So all he had to do was to inform his secretary that tonight was all go. Gosh, this was the life. What a piece of luck it had been when frumpy Miss Watson had left and gorgeous Susan had applied for the job. One look at her legs at typing, and he'd known that she would make the perfect secretary. It hadn't been long before he'd wheedled his way into her flat and found that there was more to being a boss than firing and hiring. A nightclub, well out of the city, was the ideal spot to take Susan. No one would spot them there. This was his element. When Susan, as he expected, couldn't understand the French menu, Rod was able to show off unashamedly by ordering in flawless French. One thing, though, he'd better go and phone Helen to tell her not to wait up for him, as he would be even later home than he'd first thought. While he was away, Susan couldn't help noticing a man at the next table kept looking at her. The next evening, it was flowers and a visit to Susan's flat. What a greeting! His wife couldn't even manage a grunt, let alone a kiss like this. But there was a witness. That same man that had been at the nightclub just happened to be driving by. Today was a special occasion, so Rod had given Susan the afternoon off. She wanted to prepare something special for them to enjoy that evening. The occasion? Well, it was now a month since they'd first met. He could never remember the date of his own wedding anniversary, but the date Susan had walked into his office was burnt indelibly into his memory. Such an occasion called for nothing less than red carnations. His sexy little MG was parked just around the corner, nice and convenient. The smell of the carnations tantalizingly reminded him of Susan's perfume and made his heart race at the prospect of seeing her again. The private detective that Helen had hired was now familiar with Rod's movements and couldn't miss recognizing his distinctive sports car as it zoomed under the bypass. His client had specified that she wanted exact times of her husband's comings and goings, so that was what he was giving her, right down to the very last minute. From the well-stocked wine cabinet, he selected a suitable dry sherry to go with the meal that Susan had prepared. Candles, soft music, lovely surroundings, and most of all, a beautiful companion. This certainly beats sitting at home watching Coronation Street with his wife. The success of his clandestine activities so far had made him cocky. He'd visited Susan on innumerable evenings, and Helen hadn't been suspicious. She was so wrapped up in her television soap operas that she probably didn't even notice he wasn't there. So, if he'd got away with the evenings, why not try for a whole weekend? It was a business trip, he'd explained, absolutely unavoidable. He laughingly told Susan all about it over the phone. Yes, he actually told Helen he hated having to leave her alone so much. But he really was carrying the firm completely on his own shoulders. There was no one else he could trust. What a story, and she believed every word of it. He'd missed his vacation. He should have been a fiction writer. A whole weekend stretched ahead. 2 days, 2 evenings, and 2 nights, with Susan within touching distance the whole time. He was so excitedly preoccupied with anticipation that he failed yet again to notice the familiar car that, had he bothered to look in his rear-view mirror, he would have seen had been following him for days. On Saturday night, he took Susan to their favorite nightclub once again. Hang the expense. Cost was irrelevant. Just to see the envy on the faces of all the other males in the room was more than reward enough. Eat your hearts out, chaps. She's mine, all mine. The next day, the detective phoned in with his report and received his precise instructions for the evening. It looked as if time was running out for Rod and his little game. Helen obviously had something planned. The wonderful weekend was nearly over, and it had been all that Rod hoped for. He dreaded the thought of going home to his wife tomorrow, but with an effort he thrust that chilling future aspect out of his mind and concentrated on the present. One last glass of wine before they got down to some serious lovemaking. The couple were so preoccupied that they never heard the stealthy movements outside the flat door, or the pop of the cylinder cap being ejected. They never even noticed when the anesthetic gas started streaming into the room. The first thing they did notice was a strange pepperminty smell. But of course, once they'd smelled that strange odor and identified it, it was too late. Their minds were swimming, and their nervous systems were already numb. They would be out for hours. The time of Helen's reckoning was on hand. She had planned it so her husband would discover, in a guilt-ridden flash, that he hadn't been clever after all. When he woke, he would find himself back home and securely chained to a chair. He wouldn't be going anywhere for some time, but Helen and her detective friend were. They were off to celebrate the successful conclusion of the case, and where better to celebrate than in a certain nightclub that her husband knew so intimately. Helen hadn't had an excuse to dress up and go out for years, and here she was with an attractive young man in glamorous surroundings. She hardly knew herself. This called for the best bottle of champagne in the house. A toast to the sweetness of revenge. Rod was coming round. What on earth? How did you get here? My God! Helen must have known all the time. Oh, no! Chained to the chair. Ah, well, back to reality. It had been a wonderful dream, but that was all it was. It couldn't last. Helen had him over a barrel. One word to her father, and he'd be right out of his good job in the family firm. Of late, he had conveniently overlooked the reason why he'd married Helen in the first place.